Hi, everyone, and welcome to another lecture. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing psychoanalytic literary theory. Now, this approach draws from the work of Sigmund Freud, he's right here, who believed that human behavior is deeply influenced by unconscious desires, fears, and childhood experiences. So, just as Freud examined dreams and behavior to uncover hidden meanings, we'll look at literature in a similar way. Let's get started. Now, if psychoanalysis can help us better understand human behavior, then it must also help us understand literature, because literature is created by and about humans. Now, this type of criticism really helps us see how characters, symbols, and themes reflect deep psychological truths. Freud believed that the unconscious mind really drives much of what we do, and his goal was really to help people resolve these inner conflicts. And he focused on destructive patterns and how they link back to buried desires and fears. Now, in literature, this theory helps us understand how characters whose behaviors seem maybe irrational or emotionally charged. Let's talk about family conflicts. Okay, so Freud famously theorized the Oedipus complex. You may have heard of it. It's very pretty prevalent in popular culture, I would say. Now, the Oedipus complex argues that a child experiences this subconscious desire for the opposite sex parent and rivalry with the same sex parent. So, for boys, this is usually resolved through fear of the father's punishment. And for girls, he proposed the electric complex. Now, these ideas may seem extreme, but they can really help us explore how family relationships shape identity and desire in literature. Yes, the meaning of dreams. So, Freud believed that our unconscious mind actually reveals itself most clearly in dreams. Have you ever Googled, why did I dream that all my teeth fell out? So, dreams disguise threatening thoughts through symbols. Now, in literature, this shows up when characters' dreams, or even through the entire narrative. So they stand in for hidden emotions or unresolved trauma. Now, psychoanalytic critics look for these symbolic substitutions. So, an example we have here is dreaming about a child almost always reveals something about our feelings toward ourselves, towards the child that is still within us, and that's probably still wounded in some way. Okay, let's talk about the meaning of death. Now, death is a really powerful force in our psyche, and Freud argued that people fear death but also feel drawn to it. So, something he called the death drive. Now, this really helps explain characters who act self destructively or seem obsessed with endings, loss, or abandonment. Now, literature often treats death in a really abstract way, which helps authors and readers avoid its full emotional weight. Okay, let's talk about the meaning of sexuality. Now, sexuality is really shaped not just by biology, but by our culture and society. Now, Freud believed that our social norms often suppress these sexual desires, leading to guilt or repression. Now, literature reflects this tension, especially in how it frames quote unquote acceptable versus unacceptable relationships or behaviors. Now, as we mentioned, society's rules and their definitions concerning sexuality form a large part of our superego. And the word superego implies these feelings of guilt, even though some of the time we shouldn't, because we're socially programmed to kind of feel guilty when we break off from social values or the social status quo. For an example, would be premarital sex. Okay. So Freud divided the psyche into three parts. So we have the superego, and the superego represents moral rules and guilt. So it's in direct opposition to the id and the psychological reservoir for our instincts and libido. Now, the id is devoted to gratifying all of our prohibited desires: sex, power, amusement, food, the pleasure principle, essentially, which we'll talk about later. Now, the id is that raw desire and instinct. So this often includes forbidden things that are forbidden by social convention. And the superego determines which desires the id will contain. So they're closely linked. I mean, these are all closely linked. Next, we have the ego, and the ego is the mediator between them. So the ego plays referee essentially between the id and the superego. And it is the product of the conflict we feel between the desire that we may have, that is quote unquote forbidden, and what society tells us we cannot have. Now, when applying a psychoanalytic lens to literature, the critic's job is to ask, what psychological concepts are at play beneath the surface of the text? So, in other words, how might the unconscious mind be shaping the characters, the plot, or even the narrator's behavior? Now, there's several directions that this can take. So, you might explore works that reflect edible dynamics, such as tensions between parents and children, rivalry, forbidden desire. Now, these family relationships often hint at a deeper emotional or psychological conflict. You could also examine how the text addresses death or sexuality. Now, Freud saw this as fundamental human preoccupations. Literature often expresses a tension between life and death, desire and repression. Or you could pay attention to how a character's unconscious problems show up through the story. So they may behave irrationally, contradict themselves, or obsess over something without really knowing why. Now, these patterns can be signs of repression or internal conflict bubbling up into the unconscious world. Okay. Now we have this visual analysis. This is Freud's iceberg. Now, this image illustrates Freud's iceberg model of the human mind. So the tip of the iceberg, so this is the part that's visible above the water, represents the conscious mind. So these are the thoughts and awarenesses that we actively experience and we know as our reality. But beneath the surface, which is a much larger mass, is the unconscious mind, which holds our hidden fears, desires, our memories. So even though we're unaware of them, these unconscious forces continue to shape our behavior and emotions. Now, this iceberg is a really great metaphor, not only for the human psyche, but also for literature, because much of what drives a story's characters and themes lies beneath the surface. And so he divided it into three key components. So we have the bottom, which we talked about earlier. So we have here the pleasure principle. And this is the id. So this is entirely unconscious. This is driven by our primal instincts. And it's the source of our most basic urges. So this includes hunger, aggression, sexual desire. And the id demands immediate gratification. And it doesn't consider morality or consequences. Next, we have the superego. Now, the superego is for the most part unconscious, and it acts as our internal moral compass. So this is formed through parental guidance, societal rules, cultural values that we may hold. Now, the superego judges our thoughts and behaviors, producing feelings like guilt or shame when we stray from what's considered acceptable. If you've ever watched this Netflix show called Big Mouth, and somewhere in the show the kids encounter the shame, it's like the shame monster, I think. It's pretty funny, but that kind of reminds me of this, and these feelings of guilt or shame that all of a sudden like develop within us when we're heading into like teenagehood. Okay, next we have the ego. And so the ego mediates between the impulsive id and the judgmental superego. Now, the ego is partly conscious and works to make rational decisions. So this is trying to satisfy its desires in a socially appropriate way. So while avoiding the disapproval of the superego. Now, together, all these elements show the constant tension at play within the mind. So this is a struggle that psychoanalytic critics often explore in literature to better understand a character's inner life and motivations. Now, to apply psychoanalysis, we have to ask ourselves, what forces are at play in a story? So, is there a focus on family conflict, death, sexuality, or emotional repression? Do characters act out of fear, guilt, or desire? So, you want to look for these recurring patterns or symbols. So, these are signs of the unconscious at work. You can start by analyzing the characters. So, think about what motivates them. Are their actions irrational or conflicted? So often these inner lives reflect common human struggles or even the author's own unresolved issues. So, for example, in Hamlet, the prince's behavior reflects Freud's theory of repression and the Oedipal dynamic. So remember, all creative works come from the mind, conscious or unconscious, and any narrative or image can carry psychological meaning. So this theory isn't just for analyzing stories. We can use it to interpret film, visual art, or even popular media. Now let's dive into the questions that we might ask. What is repressed in the story? Are there signs of unresolved trauma, shame, or desire? Do characters act out patterns rooted in childhood? For Hamlet, we might ask, does his inaction reveal guilt? Is his obsession with his mother rooted in unresolved sexual conflict? Well, we can also ask ourselves, what do the dreams mean? So they're usually symbolic or layered, and we may ask ourselves, what dream symbols are present? So do characters or objects stand in for fears or desires? And in Hamlet, we can think of the ghost. So the ghost can symbolize buried trauma or the return of repressed guilt. You can also look for symbols of death and sexuality. So those are yonic and phallic symbols. So yonic representing the female anatomy and phallic representing the male anatomy. Now, we can also ask ourselves how symbols, especially those linked to death and sexuality, reflect these inner struggles. As we mentioned, we can look for yonic imagery, etc. Now, in Hamlet, who is a devoted son, while underplaying his contribution to the family dysfunction, think about what that might say about the repressive tendencies of that group of critics. So maybe acknowledging Hamlet's faults as a bad son and boyfriend reinforces the reader to acknowledge similar faults in his or her own relationships. We want to ensure that when we are reading something, we are aware of our own conscious biases or the stories that we bring to the material. All right, let's try it. So here we have Twilight, very popular. So you may ask yourself in Twilight, why is the apple so prominent? Why do we have these recurrent images of an apple? Why is a girl holding it? What does apple symbolize? What does it say about the author's repressed desires? What is sexual about the apple? Does the image of an apple have any religious meaning? So these questions don't necessarily have a quote unquote right answer. They're really just about uncovering meaning through this psychological lens. Okay. To wrap it up, psychoanalytic criticism can help us see how stories reflect the human mind, our fears, our dreams, and our deepest conflicts. So whether you're analyzing Hamlet, a film, or anything really in pop culture, this theory invites us to read between the lines and beneath the surface. All right, thanks so much for listening, and I will chat with you all later. Bye.